Women must be good, man can be bad. How we cancel women for falling short. As Jane Austen once said, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a man in possession of a decent image is less likely to get his reputation tarnished than that of a woman with an above average one. Just kidding. She never actually said that. But as an author who often spoke about the inequalities that women faced, she would most likely agree with this statement. Today, I want to speak about an aspect of feminism that I believe is not discussed often enough, and that is how cancel culture is deeply shaped by gender norms and unrealistic expectation that we solely have for women. I kept asking myself the questions of why do men seem to get away with so much more than women do? But also of why does the public often have widely different reactions to men and women making the same mistakes? The answer relies on how women have been seen for centuries and how they are held to much higher standard than men are, to the point that when they fail to reach those expectations, they are automatically seen as evil. Let's dive deeper into this really important topic. To really understand the complexity of this subject, we need to start looking way back into history. Unfortunately, women have had little to no right from the beginning of time. Misogyny itself is widely considered to be the oldest form of oppression. It is also the most accepted form as discrimination, as it's seen in every culture, even when they're at their core very matriarchal. Joanna Lewis explains it as such. There is a tendency to view pre-industrial societies or rurality as non-extractive and eco-friendly, one assumption being that misogyny didn't exist. An intersectional approach to violence against women and girls rightly reveal how issues such as class, ethnicity, and region make certain groups more vulnerable and how more systemic approach to injustice is required. But to ignore cultures of misogyny within those categories of analysis ignore basic truths and patterns. Building on that, we can see how misogyny has always been deeply ingrained in our society. One big example of this is the Salem witch trials, which occurs in colonial Massachusetts between early 1692 and mid 1693. During this event, more than 200 women were accused of practicing witchcraft, and more than 20 of them were executed. Many of these accusations were based simply on assumptions because these women often did things that were not considered the standard for women. One could argue that this is one of the earliest examples of cancel culture, although quite on the extreme side. With this example in mind, we can see how when men behave even slightly of what is expected of them, they have to deal with extremely harsh repercussions. We certainly cannot discuss this topic without acknowledging the intersectionality of it all. Being a woman is not the only identity that's shaped how one is judged. Race, sexuality, social class, and many more identifiables plays a huge role in how we are seen in society. A white woman, for example, will certainly face racism, but her whiteness still protects her, which is something that women of color and even men of color are not beneficiaries of. Similarly, a transgender white man will face transphobia, but he still benefits from being white, and it's almost like a shield that will protect him at first glance. These overlapping identities matter, but despite all those differences, misogyny remains the sole oppression that exists among all the groups. It is so rooted in our society that even when a gay man who himself experiences many levels of discrimination, he could still find it in him to be a misogynist. In contrast, historically, men have been allowed to get away with much more. After all, we have been living in a patriarchal society for centuries. Men, consistently positioned at the top, have been the ones setting societal standards and expectations. These standards for men have often framed their behavior as natural, making it that even when actions were harmful and objectively problematic, it was overlooked. Being in positions of power have allowed men to avoid accountability regardless of their actions. A great example of that is how the overwhelming majority of war criminals have been men. This has led to society being familiar with extreme male violence. Due to this similarity, their modern misbehavior seems minor in comparison, and thus often just dismissed as, this is just how men are. In modern time, this behavior persists. Think about the classic phrase, boys will be boys. According to dictionary.com, it was first recorded in English in 1589. It originated from a Latin proverb, children are children and do childish things. While a bit obvious, if it had remained intact as such, it wouldn't be so problematic. Children, in fact, do childish things, and that's to be expected to some degree. Like a bad game of telephone, however, the phrase has morphed over the years into a flippant way to excuse the action and attitudes of boys and men of all ages. It's typically used to explain rowdy and naughty behavior, things like jumping in mud, puddles, row housing, and raising Cain. It's also, unfortunately, used to explain away things like sexual assault allegations and other serious crimes. It doesn't hold individuals responsible for their behavior and choices, but rather infer all males are pre-programmed to act in such way. As mentioned earlier, society has become so acclimated to men's behavior that it often goes unchecked. It starts when they're young. A boy being rude or messy is easily excused and accepted, but a girl doing the same thing is labeled as bad and can even be seen as scandalous this time. This double standard follows into adulthood. In modern dating, for example, that's why phrases like men ain't shit are so popular. It shows how even women themselves have normalized consistent patterns of cheating, neglect, and mistreatment from men. When women do similar things, they are judged much more harshly and are quite frankly even seen as the Antichrist. The burden falls on women to navigate men's flaws. They have to protect themselves and manage heartbreak. They have to constantly walk on eggshells while men face little to no accountability for their action. And let's just be honest, it is just seen as, hey, that's just how men are. With all that in mind, we can fully understand how this double standard shows up in the way of how the public mistreats women who misstep. In a study published by Cambridge University Press, it was concluded that while scandal and policy incongruence on their own generally were not enough to harm either men or women candidate at the ballot box, we consistently found that coupling public deviation and scandal produced significant effects, and gender played an important role. Our main candidate was affected when caught viewing pornography, laughing at a person experiencing homelessness, and embezzling, but not when tearing up a copy of the Constitution. In contrast, our women candidates suffered when caught viewing pornography, tearing up the Constitution, or embezzling, but not for laughing at a person who is homeless, only if subjects also viewed compensatory information about her. The study concluded that essentially the male political candidate got away with the same action that women had to give compensatory information for in order to avoid backlash. Another great example of cancel culture, but this time in the entertainment world, is the lore behind Courtney Love and Kurt Cobain. They were in a very public, toxic, and messy relationship, to say the least. They both heavily used drugs to the point where it affected their everyday lives and them parenting. Yet, despite them both being guilty of these actions, the public's perception of them separately was like water and fire. Courtney Love is a malign, complicated woman who is living proof that men are allowed to be messy rock stars in a way that women are not. She is liberated for all the things her late husband Kurt Cobain was celebrated for, where he was seen as grungy and moody. She was seen as dirty and difficult. While his work was venerated, hers was dismissed and her success accredited to him. If he was ambitious, she was seen as opportunistic. Some even blame Love for Cobain's suicide, dubiously claiming that she hired a hitman to kill him. Not only does this undermine his mental health struggle, but it's also evidence of a woman still being held accountable for the well-being of her partner. So why is it that women must be good while men are allowed to be bad? If we retake a look at everything we've discussed, we can conclude that it's because men have always dominated our societies. Historically, they have held power in almost every aspect. They were the ones that set the rules, defined the standard, and most importantly, the behaviors that benefit them were the ones that were set. Women were always in the background, treated as just a stepping stone. They were the ones deciding what were acceptable for both men and women. Men, that is. This has been upkept throughout centuries, but not only the men, but even the women themselves, but unconsciously. Diane Popescu described it as such. The public is hence not a space where existing inequalities are neutralized, but a site of struggle between the groups falling comfortably within what we commonly identify as the public, in forms of expression characteristics of what Foster called subaltern counterpublics, comprising members of subordinated social groups. To have power to cancel and even power to count as an outreach public, contestations need to gain the assent of a significant enough share of voices that are seen as constituting the public for them to be successful in stripping public figures of their privileged status. Otherwise, cancellation by progressive pockets of the public may lead to increased esteem and influence in other, potentially more public privilege arenas. To put it simply, women never had the privilege or freedom to make mistakes, and because they have kept it and actually followed the expectation for so long, any wrongdoing is automatically seen as scandalous and dare I say wicked. The foundation has already been destroyed, so even when there you are trying to make it a fair space to be cancelable, the foundation is just not built to do it that way. Meanwhile, men benefit from a system that they created that excuses and minimizes their wrongdoings. To conclude, how can we make a change and give women more freedom to make mistakes and perhaps even be bad? I believe the answer lies in simply humanizing women, but also in no longer accepting the bare minimum from men. And by the bare minimum from men, I mean not taking any more of their unexcusable behavior and justifying it just because they are men. And it starts from when they're very young, from the way we raise our little girls and our little boys. The things that we deem acceptable in our relationship, whether platonic or romantic. The same thing you wouldn't take from a guy friend, you shouldn't take it from a girlfriend. We constantly make excuses, for example, when a significant other does something to us, and I would argue especially in heterosexual relationships, but we often let go so easily of our girlfriends despite one little mistake. Why do we constantly afford those chances to men? It's important that what we see as unacceptable from women is also seen as unacceptable from men and vice versa. I believe that this will lead to a society of women being more free and therefore allowed to make mistakes and learn from them instead of being scrutinized, villainized, and being seen as the villain, but also making them more good and therefore less bad.